He has authored several books. Open Heart is one that we gave away last year. I've read it, fascinating chronicling of many of the historical cardiac surgeons. He's also written and published the book that he's going to be talking about today, Doctors of Another Calling, Physicians Known Best for Their Achievements Outside of Medicine. He told me a little bit about it, and it was really interesting, and I'm so proud that he's here, and I think we're all going to enjoy his presentation. Dr. Cooper.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, again. And what I'm going to talk about today is based on a book that I edited a couple of years ago. And I have a copy here for Joe, which I'll give to him afterwards. Unfortunately, I couldn't put enough copies in for all of you in my case when I was coming. And it's got this title, Doctors of Another Calling. And I'm a member of a society in the United States called the American Osler Society, which is based on, Osler was a very famous physician at the beginning, the last part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. It's a very humanitarian, very gifted general physician. And the society is really there to follow his teachings of medicine as a whole, not just ordering tests and so on, but actually listening to the patient and so on, and also is involved with the history of medicine. And I knew that a lot of my colleagues at this small society were interested in doctors who had made their name outside of medicine, were known not as doctors, but as for other attributes. And I'd been always interested in those, and so we put a book together, picking out about 40 or so of doctors, some of whom you will know of, and some of whom you may not have heard about. But there are literally hundreds we could have put in the book, but we tried to choose a few of the better known ones. Now, before I go on to that, I work in Pittsburgh. Everybody tends to think of Pittsburgh as the big smoky city with all the steelworks and so on, which it used to be. There's actually a plaque downtown in Pittsburgh that says that during the Second World War, Pittsburgh made more steel than all of the rest of the world put together, which is quite a remarkable thing when you consider the amount of steel that was being manufactured in the Second World War. But it's now a very clean, lovely city. The main employer is healthcare, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, ALIGHIERI Hospital, and so on. And the second biggest employer is academia, the University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, and lots of other smaller colleges. So it's changed dramatically in the last 30 years or so since the steel industry sort of collapsed in the 1980s. And it's a very pleasant city in which to live. It reputedly has more bridges in it than any other city in the world except Venice. I'm not sure if that's true, but it certainly has a lot of bridges because there's 2 rivers and lots of hills and so on and so on. And it looks nice by day, and it looks nice in the evening as well. So it's a very attractive place in which to live. So you're at a meeting now, a conference on medicine, and I want to show you this slide before I go on to anything else. This is a report in 1984 of a survey they did of people coming out of one of these meetings at the end of the conference. And they asked the people there, they said, what were they doing during it? They said that 10% of the people attending the conference actually listened to the speaker, 20% are physically present but mentally elsewhere, 20% are asleep, and the rest are indulging in sexual fantasies. So when you wake up in a few minutes' time and you don't remember what I've been saying, you want to work out which group you fall into here. I used to say that any young ladies falling into the sexual fantasy group should come and see me afterwards, but I'm too old for that now, I'm afraid. Then it says here, too, that they said that we know that a male speaker has about 27 seconds to grab his audience's attention. That's how long it takes before they decide whether to turn off. And a woman speaker has a bit longer, presumably because she's better looking, about 55 to 60 seconds to grab your attention. So in the first 27 seconds, I put this slide up to grab your attention in the hope that I can now keep it a little bit longer. And then one more point before I go into the topic I'm supposed to be talking about, and this is a thing that I think you'll like, by a quote by David Wheatley, who's a surgeon in Britain. I'm sometimes reminded of the differences between a rhinoceros and a cardiac surgeon. One has a thick skin, a small brain, and charges a lot. The other is a large animal that lives in Africa. Now, you're only allowed to make that joke if you're a cardiac surgeon, and I used to be a cardiac surgeon, so I'm safe from that point of view. But that gives you some idea of how some people think of cardiac. He's a cardiac surgeon too, of course. Now, there's a surprisingly large number of doctors who became writers, who are well known as writers. I don't know why there's so many. It may be that as a doctor you see life at some of its most difficult times, and most emotional crises, and maybe the doctor uses that in many of his writings, and in fact some of them do, and I'll give you some examples of that. There are far more writers than there are, say, musicians or composers or artists or sculptors. So it seems that writing and medicine go much more together than the other arts that we could have. Now, the first one I want to pick out is St. Luke. Obviously wrote the Gospel according to St. Luke. He was known to be a doctor. He was called the beloved physician by St. Paul. And they say that his Gospel is one of the more literary of the Gospel. It's better written than the other ones. So he was probably one of the first of the doctors who made their name out of writing, really. That's how we remember him, not as a doctor. And then in the sort of Middle Ages, there was Dante, who wrote some very long, very highly regarded poetry. He was a doctor in Florence. He was actually, it's known he was a doctor because he was the physician representative on the sort of board of magistrates of the city, and they chose one from the guild, one from the medical guild, and so on. And so he wrote his great trilogy was Purgatory, Heaven, and Inferno or Hell. So he's considered a great classical writer, and he was based on a medical background. And then I'm always interested in John Keats, who was what they call one of the romantic poets in Britain, that included Wordsworth and Byron and Shelley and people like that, a period of time when there were a lot of very good, gifted poets there. I'm particularly interested in him because he actually studied medicine at the same hospital that I did in London, Guy's Hospital. And although in the 19th century, Guy's at one time had Hodgkin's disease, Addison of Addison's disease, and Bright of Bright's disease, or glomerulonephritis, all on the staff at the same time together. You could arguably say that John Keats, who only practiced medicine for a few months after he graduated, is probably the best known of the alumni of this medical school, because he's very well known throughout the world for his poetry. Sadly, his whole family had tuberculosis. He nursed his mother, she died of tuberculosis, his brother died of tuberculosis, and he himself died when he was in his middle 20s of tuberculosis. So he had a very short career, but is remembered as one of the great British poets. Now, in the US, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was professor of anatomy at Harvard Medical School, and then he became dean of the medical school, so he was well regarded in the medical field. Actually is probably remembered now mainly as a writer. He wrote a lot of articles, columns, stories, and so on. And he's probably, I say, better known now for his writing than he was for his medical contributions. Here's somebody you probably have heard of, Anton Chekhov, one of probably the greatest of the Russian writers, published over 500 pieces of work, literature, in his career. Some of his plays are still produced. There's almost always one in the West End of London, which he wrote, well over 100 years ago. And he actually continued to live and to work as a physician throughout that period of time, even though he started writing when he was a medical student. He made more money out of writing than he did out of medicine, but he ran a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients for quite a long time. And he himself died of tuberculosis, you can see, at an age of 44. Rather sad, but was a very prolific writer, and is remembered, and probably was the second best writer that Russia has produced, other than Tolstoy, whom he knew quite well, and they were quite friends together. Now, this is somebody that in Britain particularly we remember as the author of Sherlock Holmes' stories. And this is Arthur Conan Doyle. He was from Edinburgh, or near Edinburgh in Scotland. He studied medicine at Edinburgh. And in fact, Sherlock Holmes to a large extent is based on one of the physicians that was one of his mentors at Edinburgh. There was one physician, Joseph Bell, who was particularly astute at diagnosis. And he, I think he was actually a surgeon, but he was very astute at diagnosis. He could pick up little things just by looking at the patient, talking to the patient. It can almost come to a diagnosis without actually ever examining the patient. And Arthur Conan Doyle was very impressed by this guy's powers of observation. And he used that in his Sherlock Holmes stories, because Sherlock Holmes was very observant about little things, little details that that's how he could solve the problem by watching and picking up these little details. And it was really based on Joseph Bell. In fact, Joseph Bell got a bit annoyed that people were always coming up to him, talking to him about Sherlock Holmes and so on in his life. And you also remember that one of Sherlock Holmes' his close friend was Dr. Watson. And Dr. Watson put a sort of medical spin on a lot of it all and was used by Sherlock Holmes to give him some medical background and so on. And so that's where Conan Doyle used his medical knowledge by bringing in this character, Dr. Watson. The interesting about him, too, is that when he graduated in Edinburgh, he then went down to the south coast of England, and he was a general practitioner for a number of years in a place called Southsea, which is next to Portsmouth. And he did quite well, but he got very interested in ophthalmology, and he used to attend to the local eye clinic and help the eye surgeon there. And at one stage of his career, he decided he would like to go in to become an eye specialist. He was already publishing magazine articles, short stories, and so on during this period of time. But he decided he would like to he didn't think of giving up medicine at all. He didn't think he would make enough money from the writing. So he actually took 6 months off and went to Switzerland, where he studied under an eye specialist. He said it wasn't very effective because he didn't really understand the German enough to know what the heck the guy was telling him about it all. But he did pick up quite a bit, and when he went back, he set up in central London, in the main part where most of the doctors have their private rooms and so on, and he set up as an ophthalmologist. And he said for a long time, hardly any patients came to see him. So he spent all day sitting in this rented office, and he took to writing more. And he realized after a fairly short time that he could make more money writing than he could in his ophthalmology. So he then decided he would give up and he would become a writer full time. And that's when he really blossomed and became a very well-known. People would actually line up, most of the Sherlock Holmes stories and so on were published in newspapers and so on. People would line up to get the next edition to know what was happening. It was rather like Charles Dickens did the same thing, that they kept the people's attention by publishing, another episode each day, and people would line up to buy the paper at the earliest possible moment. Now, here's a guy who's not a physician, but he was a dentist, and so I included him here. Zane Grey, you've probably heard about him. He was one of the great Western writers, made a fortune, probably one of the earliest writers ever to make $1 million, I'm told. They reckon that even though he died in 1939, his books sold at least $40 million worth of books, so he became a very wealthy man. And it was all based on the West, cowboys and so on and so on. And many of his stories were made into movies and television programs and so on subsequently. Now, going back to Britain again, this was another physician who was trained at the same, not exactly the same hospital, but a linked hospital, St. Thomas's Hospital in London, as I was. And he also he wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his life. All his family were lawyers, and he didn't want to become a lawyer because he had a very bad stutter, and they thought he wouldn't do very well in court if he was stuttering all the time. So his family's physician suggested that he might take up medicine. He wasn't really highly motivated, but he thought it would give him an income, and he could write in his spare time. And as a student, he wrote a novel based on his experience as a student. It was in most of the big London teaching hospitals were in very poor parts of the city, where the community was very poverty-stricken and so on around them. That's why the hospital started there as charitable institutions to treat these patients who from these poor areas. And St. Thomas's was surrounded by an area of very poor people at the time. And he wrote a book called Lisa of Lambeth, Lambeth being the area in which St. Thomas's is. And it was about a poor woman. And he'd seen these people because he used to go to as a medical student, he used to go to their homes to deliver the babies. And he delivered about 60 babies in this area. And on the basis of that, he wrote this first novel, which more or less established him. He then graduated in medicine, and he was thinking if the book hadn't done very well, he was going to become a ship's surgeon and see the world. But he thought on the basis of this one book that he probably could make a living out of it. So he gave up medicine almost immediately and took to writing. And he said in retrospect it was a bad decision because it took him some years to write another book that was as equally successful, and he was struggling for a long time. And he said if he could have worked in the day of medicine and made enough money and just written in the evening. So he regretted it, but eventually did become very wealthy and very successful, probably one of the most successful British writers of all time. A lot of his film stories and novels were made into movies and so on. He had a very interesting life too, because in the First World War he joined the British Secret Service and was sent to Russia for a while. And in the Second World War he was sent over to the US in order to try to encourage the US to enter the war at that time. So he had a very interesting life, lived to an old age and so on. Then Frank Slaughter, another name you probably remember, he was a very popular writer, physician, wrote, a lot of his work was based on his medical experience. I wouldn't say he was a great writer, but he certainly was a very popular writer and used his medical background to write novels based on medical things. And then coming up to more recent times, Robin Cook, who is an eye specialist, but he became a very successful writer. You probably remember seeing the film Coma, and then Chromosome 6 was another one of his very famous books. Must have made a great deal of money, lives in Boston, and has been very successful, as has the next guy who's also based originally in Boston, Michael Crichton, with his dinosaurs and the Andromeda Strain. Not only became a very successful writer, but also went into the movie business as a director and so on, and did extremely well. I had the privilege, I taught anatomy at Harvard Medical School for a year, and he was in the class that I taught at the time. And I remember him, I'm 6'5", and I think he's 6'9", so he was one of the people that towered over us all. He did practice medicine. I think he did his internships after he graduated, but then I think he pretty quickly went into the writing and movie business. And then another Harvard Medical School graduate is Charles Krauthammer, that some of you have probably seen on CNN and other Fox TV and so on. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, mainly a political commentator and so on, not a novelist, but very successful in what he's done. You may have noticed too that he is always sitting down, because as a student he had a terrible injury. I think he dove into a pool and hit his head and broke his neck, and he's at least paraplegic even, and he's got some limitation of his arms as well. So incredibly, he finished his medical training. He actually graduated as a doctor despite that huge disability, and has made a very successful career both in the television and in his writing attributes. So quite a remarkable person, I think. And then somebody who you perhaps know best for one particular novel, The Kite Runner, which made into an excellent film, is Khalid Hosseini, who was brought up in Afghanistan, in Kabul, and then came as a teenager to the US. Here he is with former President Bush and his wife. And he went into medicine. I think his family put some pressure on him because they struggled when they first came to the US, because his parents were both professional people, but they had to start all over again, I think, in a very lowly job when they came. And he thought that you know, they put pressure on him to get a job where he actually wouldn't be struggling financially. But he never really wanted to do medicine, and he actually hated it. He had a job where he just did outpatient work, and so it was a sort of 8 till 4 job, and he went home in the evenings and he wrote. And he thought, I can't do this for 35 years, but he thought, well, I may have to because there was nothing else he could do. But then he'd written a book, The Kite Runner. He'd written a short story, The Kite Runner. His wife said that was very good. She said, can't you put it into a novel? And he put it into a novel, and that got published and made him a lot of money, and he was able to give up his medical career, which I say he disliked completely. And he hasn't really used his medical background in his writing. He's really used his Afghanistan background, because most of his novels have been related to his childhood and his heritage from Afghanistan. Now, not a novelist, but somebody I'm sure you've heard of is Peter Mark Roget, Roget's Thesaurus. And he was a doctor for the whole of his life. And then when he retired at 61, he decided he would collect all these words in the English language and put them in a format where you could choose an alternative word or an opposite word. It took him several years to do this, and he published this Thesaurus, which has been published and updated ever since his lifetime, and it's been one of the most purchased books of all time, because it's renewed every few years and so on. Why he had this interest in words, I'm not sure, but he spent, I say, many years after retirement working full-time on collecting these words together. And I was mentioning to somebody last night, I heard somebody who'd written a novel and sent it to a literary agent, and the agent said, well, I like the words, but couldn't you reorganize them somehow or other? And so they probably would need Roget's Thesaurus in order to reorganize the words, because the novel wasn't too good. Now, there are some other writers that I won't go into. I've chosen three of them from the South here. William Carlos Williams, who was a poet, Mikhail Bulgakov from Russia, who did use his medical background to write and was very popular in Russia. Walker Percy, another Southern writer, and Ferrell Sam. But there are a host of others that I could have selected if we were going to have time to go through them all. Now, I say far fewer composers, musicians, and artists. The only artist of any note I came across was a London artist, Sir Henry Tonks, who was quite a good artist himself, not one of the absolute top-rated ones, but he became a professor of art at the Royal Academy of Art in London, so he must have been of some stature. But although lots of doctors take up art as a hobby, it doesn't appear there have been many that really have either moved into it as a full-time profession or have really hit the big time in it, as there are with the writers, for example. Composers, there's just one or two. Berlioz was a medical student, but he gave it up. He didn't like it, and he wanted to write music. And the only one that I can really find that you may know about is Alexander Borodin. He was from the Russian school. He trained as a doctor. He became a professor of chemistry at the medical school, and his whole career was in chemistry. He did it for years, so that was his full-time job. But he did point out that he was a Sunday composer. He used to compose at the weekend, and he was in a musical group which included Mussorgsky and Rimsky-Korsakov, so very high-rated colleagues there. And they would spend the weekends writing or playing music and so on. And he's probably most remembered now. He wrote several important pieces, not a lot of work considering it, but that's because he was only writing at the weekends. But his probably the most important thing he wrote that we remember, he wrote a piece called Prince Igor, and that music was used for the musical Kismet. And that's all of Borodin's music that you hear in Kismet. And in fact, many years after his death, he was given a posthumous Tony Award for writing the music of Kismet, even though he'd been dead 100 years by that time. But it's a lovely music, and he was clearly a gifted composer. And many of his friends tried to persuade him to give up the chemistry side of things, the medical chemistry, but he decided to stick with that as well. And he was evidently a very good chemist. He was quite an innovative sort of guy. And then also we could include in the medical field Albert Schweitzer. He was a very gifted person. He started out really as a theologian, and he wrote extensively on theological subjects in Germany. And then at the same time, he was a gifted musician, and particularly an organist. He gave recitals around Europe as one of the great organists of the time. Particularly was an expert on the work of Johann Sebastian Bach. And he was a recognized authority on Bach's music. But then he decided that he wanted to devote his life, probably based on his religious feelings, he wanted to devote his life to helping people who were in need of some help. So he actually got a medical qualification and then took off for the Congo in West Africa and set up a hospital in the middle of the nowhere, in the middle of the jungle, basically in Lambarini, and spent his whole life there for many, many years until he died. And did a lot of good work as a sort of a missionary out there. And as a result of the missionary work, basically, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize some years later. And so he could be included as a humanitarian or as a musician or as a theologian, probably. He's probably better known for those things than he was for actually just being a doctor. Now, there's a whole bunch of explorers around the world that we could include. Probably the best known is the Scottish explorer David Livingstone, who was again a medical missionary. He studied medicine in Scotland and went out to Africa to really to cater for their medical requirements and their religious requirements, but in fact became much more of an explorer than a medical missionary. He got entranced by exploring around Central Africa. This was a time when it hadn't been explored. He was the first European to cross Africa from east to west. He was the first European to see the Victoria Falls in between Zambia and Rhodesia. And several other things were first. He made a big effort to try and find the source of the Nile River, but he was unable to locate where it actually began. But he's obviously a very well-recognized explorer. And remember, he got lost at one time, and I think it was the New York Times sent out a guy called Stanley to try to find him, and in the middle of the jungle, they hit upon each other. And Stanley said, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, and there weren't too many other white people out there at the time, so he was pretty sure he'd found the right guy. He was a rather controversial character, though, because I think there was some criticism of the medical care he gave to the people out there, but he's celebrated more as an explorer than as a physician. And then in Britain, this group is a very sort of heroic group. Every small boy learns about them. This was Captain Scott's expedition to the South Pole in the early 1900s. And Captain Scott, who was a Navy captain, is here. And these were the 5 people that actually pulled the sledge to the North Pole and then died on the way back. They were stuck with bad weather. They were a few miles from the next store of food, but they were running out of energy and they got stuck in their tent, and all 5 of them died. And this guy with him is Edward Wilson, who was the doctor on the expedition. And he'd been on an expedition with Scott previously to the Antarctic, but they hadn't tried to get to the South Pole at that time. But then on the second expedition, they did. And they did reach the South Pole, but when they got there, there was a Norwegian flag flying at the point where they realized the South Pole was, because the Norwegians had got there about a month before them. They knew that the Norwegians were trying to have an expedition there, and the big difference was the Norwegians had this sledge pulled by the dogs, and the British decided they didn't want the dogs, they would pull the sledge themselves. And I think this was their biggest mistake, because as the dogs got tired and so on, the Norwegians ate the dogs because that kept them going. And it also saved them a lot of energy because the dogs would pull the sledge for them instead of them pulling themselves. One of these guys, I think it's probably this one, is a guy called Captain Oates. And he's particularly heroic in Britain because he was an army captain, And when he got very bad frostbite and so on, he could hardly walk at one stage. And because he realized he was a burden on these guys trying to get back to the camp where they'd left the food and so on, one morning he said, or one night he said to them, I'm just going outside for a while, I may be some time. And he went out and they never saw him again. He went out, he really committed suicide because he knew he was a burden on them. My wife, who's an American who has a very bad sense of humor, says she thinks they ate him, and that's why we say we had oats for breakfast. But I don't think that's true. But she thinks they were all cannibals. But anyway, but that's so it's a heroic story. And Edward Wilson, who was not only the physician on the field, but he was a great naturalist and a very great artist. Actually, he was a very beautiful artist, and so he was painting the scenery and the penguins and the birds and so on that he found in the Antarctica, which hadn't been done before. So he left a great legacy of work, but unfortunately he died with Scott and the others. Now, interestingly, the guy that got there before them, the Norwegian, the team was led by this guy, ROALD Amundsen, who was also a Navy captain. And he had been a medical student for several years because his mother was absolutely convinced her son was to be a doctor. And then halfway through the course, his mother died, and he immediately gave up medicine and joined the Navy. And he became a very important Arctic explorer as well as an Antarctic explorer. And he was the first person to reach the South Pole with his colleagues there. And there are many, many other doctors who were explorers, mainly because in the early days, all ships carried a ship surgeon. They were not very well trained doctors, but they were ship surgeons. And therefore, many of the explorations around the world involved ship surgeons. And I lived in Cape Town for several years, and it was established by Jan van Riebeek, who was a ship surgeon with the Dutch East India Company, that was plying their ships between Holland and the Far East, where they picked up the spices and so on and brought them back. And they needed somewhere on the way to stop to get more water, fresh water, and to get fresh vegetables and so on. So they decided to set up a little colony in Cape Town on the southern tip of Africa. And Jan van Riebeek was the guy that was appointed to do that. And he's considered the founder of Cape Town, which was the first establishment of the Europeans in southern Africa. So he's considered the founder of South Africa, really, from a European perspective. And eventually he did become governor of the Cape and became quite an important person there. And if you walk down the main street of Cape Town, there's a big monument, a statue of him, Jan van Riebeek. And he started life as a ship surgeon. And there are a lot of others. There's the Bass Strait, which is between Tasmania and Australia, and that's named after another ship surgeon, George Bass, who was on the ship that first explored that area. Furthermore, most explorations, like Scott's exploration, took a doctor with them, and two in particular ones. John Richardson was a very well-known British Arctic explorer, and Charles Evans was the second in command of the British team that actually was the first to climb Everest in 1952, I think it was. So there's always a doctor on some of these Arctic or Antarctic or mountaineering things. Now, two that you would remember better than I do were David Brown and Laurel Clark, who were both doctors who were both killed in the Columbia spacecraft disaster some years ago now. Then we could go to a lot of politicians, activists, military people, revolutionaries, terrorists, and so on. There's a whole bunch of those. You would probably know better than I. These 5 doctors who, of the 56, I think it was, who signed the American Declaration of Independence. The one we remember most is probably Benjamin Rush, Rush Medical School and so on, because he was probably the best known of the doctors amongst them. But they played an important role in the early development of the United States. And I think that's true of a lot of countries, a lot of African countries. Some of the early presidents, like President Hastings Banda of Malawi, were doctors, and because they were some of the few educated people in the area at the time. Hastings Banda, for example, had been a general practitioner up in Glasgow in Scotland for some years before he went back and became a political activist and then the first president of Malawi. And if you go to China, they revere this guy, Sun Yat-sen. He was a doctor. He spent some of his youth, he was born in China, but he spent some of his youth in Hawaii because his brother had emigrated to Hawaii and became quite a successful businessman there. But he trained in medicine in Hong Kong. But during his youth, he got very interested in Chinese freedom, because China was really run by the Manchurians at the time, and he wanted to overthrow the Manchu government. And he and a group of other students became very active. Most of them lost their lives in the sort of revolutionary battle. And then it was many years before he made any progress there. And much of that time he spent traveling around the world. He spent time in the United States, he spent time in the UK and several other places. Finally, when the communists were beginning to rise, he sort of linked up with them. And in about 20 or 1912, I think it was, he actually became president of China. But China was in two bits then, the north and the south, and they kicked out the Manchurians and they took over, but two different groups took over. And because he was so keen that it should be a unified country, he very generously resigned as the president so that the president for the north could be the president of the whole country. So he was very magnanimous in that. And then he spent the rest of his life sort of writing and so on. And two of his colleagues at that time were Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, who both eventually fell out with each other. And Mao Zedong kicked out Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan during or just at the end of the Second World War. But he was very important in the development of China from being a colony of another country, Manchuria, than it was. Now, here's a very remarkable man. On the left here, you can see Theodore Roosevelt, President Theodore Roosevelt. And on the right is this guy, Leonard Wood. And he is a revelation, really. He trained in medicine at Harvard Medical School, but he was from a fairly poor background. I think he got some help in order to pay the fees at Harvard. And he wasn't a very successful doctor. For a while he practiced in general practice, but he wasn't very successful. So he volunteered for the army, and he was in the sort of volunteer reserve, but he was on active service in the army for some time as a doctor. And he got more and more involved in the actual army activities, and he was in mainly in wars against the Native Americans. And he was a sort of similar sort of guy to Roosevelt in this sort of adventurous attitude to war and so on. Eventually, the US took over Cuba, and he was put in charge in Santiago, the capital. He was put in charge as the sort of governor of Santiago. And it was a terrible place at the time. There was a lot of disease, the sanitation was terrible and so on. And he did a fantastic job in cleaning up the place and got a good reputation for that because he made a huge difference to public health, etc., etc. He then came back to the US for a while and then was sent out to the Philippines, where the US had also taken over from the Spanish in the Philippines. And they bought the Philippines from the Spanish, in fact. And he also became a governor of an area there where he became much more ruthless. And there were very bad stories about him killing thousands of women and children in clearing out some of the groups there that were causing particular trouble, the Filipino groups there. So he got a poor reputation there. But he said it was necessary in order to quell the terrorism that was going on. And then he came back, and he was actually then made chief of the army. He joined the full army by this time, and he was chief of the entire US Army. Here's a general practitioner who got in through the sort of back door and became the senior general of the entire US Army. So that's quite an amazing achievement, I think. He then actually, when Roosevelt died, he stood for the Republican nomination for president, and he wasn't elected. So he didn't become the president, but he got that far to become president. So he had a remarkable career, even though it was very controversial in many regards. But I think he's a very interesting person. The next guy is equally interesting, if not more interesting, and this is Che Guevara, who I'm sure you've heard about. He was an Argentinian. As as a youth, he took off time from medical school to travel around South America, and he was appalled at the poverty he saw in many of the countries of the ordinary peasants and so on. And so this fired him up to want to do something about it. He felt that there was a very wealthy group and a very poor group, and he wanted to do something to equalize things out. He was quite a remarkable person, even as a medical student, because the Argentinians have a very good history of rugby football playing. And as you know, rugby is a pretty tough sport. And the Argentinians have produced a lot of very good players. And he played for the University of Buenos Aires, which is one of their leading universities, of course. And he was the fly half, which is actually the equivalent of the quarterback. So he had a key player. So he must have been pretty good, because the University of Buenos Aires had a lot of very good players at the time. So he must have been very good. Now, what is even more remarkable is he suffered from childhood with severe asthma. And when he was playing rugby, he would always get a friend to run up and down the touchline with an inhaler. And when he got short of breath, he'd rush over and the guy would inhale it into his mouth so that he could breathe a bit better. Now, to be playing rugby at that top level, when you require an inhaler during the game, that takes a lot of determination, I think. So he was a person with great determination. So he joined up eventually with Fidel Castro, who's the other guy in the picture here. And they threw out the government in Cuba, as you all know, and took over. Che wasn't a very good administrator. He was more revolutionary. He wasn't very good when it came to actually administrating. Fidel Castro gave him a lot of things to administrate in Cuba, and he didn't do a great job. And eventually he left. He became a liability to Fidel Castro, really. And he eventually left, and he went out to the Congo to try to freedom fighters there to set up another revolution, and that wasn't very successful. So he ended up in, I think it was Colombia or Paraguay, and tried to set up a revolution there. And at that point he was captured because the people weren't very keen on the idea, and somebody told the government about him, and he was captured and he was summarily shot at quite a young age. I think he was only about 39 when he did that. He became, again, rather like Leonard Wood, a bit ruthless as he got older, and I think seeing all the death and destruction around him hardened him, and he ceased to become a doctor and became just. And his father wouldn't, when they took over Cuba, his father visited him, hadn't seen him for some years, and never saw him again because he was so disappointed that he felt that his son had become so hardened and so on. Now, also in the field of politicians, you can see some more recent ones. Howard Dean, who actually very kindly wrote the preface for this book of ours. He is a doctor. He's now, I think he's still maybe chairman of the Democratic Party, or he certainly was for several years, and he was a presidential candidate for a while. So he practiced medicine for several years before he really went into politics. Ron Paul, I'm sure you remember from his efforts to become president, and recently his son, both are doctors, Rand Paul, and both practiced for some years before they got involved with politics. And then coming towards the end now, we talk about some athletes and sportsmen. In Britain, we call sportsmen athletes. Here you call sportsmen outdoors people more, so that's why I put both names up. And in Britain, one of the very important ones was Roger Bannister. He was the first person to run a mile under 4 minutes. It was a great occurrence. People have been trying to do it for several years, and he did it in the 1950s. He came fourth in the 1952 Olympic Games at the mile, and he ran the first 4-minute mile, I think, in 1954. And then he won the European Championships when he won the British Commonwealth Championships. And then he retired because he just finished training as a medical student. He was a medical student at the time at St Mary's Hospital in London when he was doing this. Remarkably, he never ever had a coach. He used to coach himself. And he came over to run in the US, and when he was met at the airport, he'd just done the 4-minute mile. They asked him where was his coach and his manager, and he said, I don't have a coach or manager, it's just me. Because even by that time in the US, every athlete of any note had a sort of coach and a manager to travel around with them. He practiced medicine for the next 30, 40 years as a neurologist. He was on at the National Hospital for Neurological Disease in London, so he was a top neurologist. And then eventually he was asked to become master of an Oxford college, which is the sort of administrative head of the college. And he'd been at Oxford before he came to St Mary's Hospital, so he went back to Oxford and became, and actually in this book I actually visited him in Oxford, he's still alive, and spent the day with him, which was quite interesting to meet him at last. Now you would know more about this guy than I do, a guy called Robert Bobby Brown. He played evidently over 500 games for the New York Yankees. He was in 4 World Series, so he was one of the great baseball players. After his baseball career, during which time he'd gone through medical school while he was playing baseball, and he became a cardiologist for a number of years, I think about 11 years, and then he was asked to become president of the American League, Baseball League, and he gave up medicine to administrate the league. So he was a very well-known baseball player. Here's a guy that played only 1 Major League Baseball game, Archibald "Moonlight" Graham, and he didn't even get to bat during that one, but he played a lot of minor league games, and he was quite well known, played at college, he was a well-known player. And then he left, when he graduated and so on, he left baseball, and he became a general practitioner in, I think, Minnesota, and everybody was devoted to him because he was such a wonderful doctor to this small community in the backwoods of Minnesota. He's only really remembered, though, because the film Field of Dreams was based on him. He was the guy who said, if you build it, they will come. And so that film, which was based on a novel called Shoeless Joe, is based on this guy's life, really. Then here's a crew from Yale University. In 1924, they won the gold medal of the Olympic Games in the rowing. And one of that crew is Benjamin Spock, who was a very controversial pediatrician who gave people advice how to bring up babies. When I was a boy, everybody followed what Spock said, but since then I think a lot of what he said has been considered not to be as good as people thought it was. But here's a guy who was a gold medalist at the Olympics and then became a well-known doctor. Tenley Albright, I think in 1954, won the gold medal in the Winter Olympics for skating. She was not a doctor or a medical student at the time, but then she went on to Harvard Medical School and she eventually became a surgeon. She's still alive and she's been a reputable surgeon since that time. And here's another surgeon in the making, Eric Heiden, who in 1980, I think it was, won all of the speed skating championships at the Olympic Games. He won, I think, about 4 or 5 gold medals. In 3 or 4 of those events, he broke the Olympic record, and the other one, he broke the world record. So he was one of the greatest speed skaters of all time. And he's now, I think he's an orthopedic surgeon and has had a very good career in sort of sports medicine and orthopedics and so on. There are several others. There's a guy called David Syme, who was a track sprint world record holder. He holds several sprint records. He got an Olympic silver medalist in 1960. And you may have remembered Gary Hall Jr., who was a swimmer until recently. His father was also a swimmer and won an Olympic medalist in 3 Olympics. And both Syme and Gary Hall Sr. were doctors. In the entertainment world, there are a lot of minor people, but there are a few major ones. I don't know if any of you remember the Monty Python group, the comedy group from Britain, that was based really on some people who had studied and together at Cambridge or Oxford. And one of them, Graham Chapman here, studied at Cambridge. At the time, he followed people like David Frost, who had been there, and Peter Cook. And at the same time that he was there was John Cleese, who's probably better known. And Graham Chapman was a medical student. He then went down to London, St Bartholomew's Hospital, and he graduated, and he worked for 2 weeks, and then he never did medicine again because he got caught up into the entertainment world, became a writer for all the Monty Python things like Life of Brian and all those films they made with John Cleese. They were a writing pair together. And sadly, he died of a throat cancer several years ago and at quite a young age. Now, here's somebody you probably don't know about, George Miller, who was a movie director. He made the Mad Max films, The Happy Feet and Babe. And he's a doctor. He's Australian. I don't think he practiced medicine for very long, but he is medically qualified, but his career's been in movie direction. And John Collee who's Scottish, is also a doctor, and he was the screenwriter for films such as Master and Commander and Happy Feet. So he's become very well known as a screenwriter. Doesn't seem to have used his medicine in that, but he's drifted into that career. I suppose in entertainers we could include people like Dr. Oz, who's on the television these days, who was a very good cardiac surgeon, very good. And he was at Columbia, and he still, I think, does do a little bit of it, but he obviously doesn't do much. But he was very good and particularly strong in the very early days of assist devices. He was a real expert at the time. I was really shocked that he actually moved into the entertainment field rather than pursue, because he was obviously very gifted at what he was doing. Finally, some scientists and scholars. Copernicus, who was the first person to decide that the Earth ran around the sun rather than the other way around, which was quite revolutionary at the time. Revolutionary, that's a pun, of course. But he was a doctor for his whole career. He worked really for the church in some ways. He was a doctor to the bishops and the people in the church in Poland. But he's remembered, of course, for his astronomy. And Carl Linnaeus was a Swedish physician who actually classified all of the plants in the known world at that time, their genus and species and so on and so on. And there's a society in London now called the Linnaean Society for Botanists. And in fact, there are over 150 plants named after doctors, because doctors in the old days used to have to know all about the plants because they used herbs and so on to treat patients. It was about the only treatment they had available. And so there was a huge interest in botany, and Carl Linnaeus was probably the greatest of all those botanists. Few businessmen and philanthropists. Hans Sloane, you may not know about. He was the president of the Royal College of Physicians, president of the Royal Society, well-known London physician. And he was a great collector, natural science things, antiquities, stones, all sorts of things. And he had this collection of thousands of items. And in fact, when he died, he left them, they became the foundation of the British Museum, which is now one of the biggest museums in the world. And they were all based on Hans Sloane's collections. And you've probably heard of John Harvey Kellogg. He and his brother, he in particular, came up with the cereal cornflakes and stuff like that. His brother was the one who sort of commercialized it all. This John Harvey Kellogg, who was a doctor, his brother wasn't, was interested in sort of healthy lifestyles. He ran a sort of sanitarium for people to come and make like a health spa. Part of this was nutrition. And he came up with many of these nutrients. And his brother was the one who actually commercialized them and made a lot of money out of it. And then Armand Hammer was a remarkable man. As a young man, his father had come over from Russia. His father was a doctor. His father was put in jail because a patient died after an abortion that he had done on them. I don't know if it was a legal or illegal abortion. And so Armand Hammer, as a medical student at Columbia, took over the family business, which was a sort of trading business. And while he was a medical student, he ran this business with 1,500 staff and an income of about $1 million a year back in the early 1900s. So he was obviously a very able person. He used to pay people to go to the lectures and bring some notes, write some notes and give them to him, so he'd read those in the evening. So he really had a very weird medical education, but became a very successful businessman. His whole life was taken up in business. He became known to everybody around the world. Here he is with Prince Charles of England because he helped Prince Charles with some of his charities. He was a great art collector. His art collections ran into millions and millions of dollars. He became very friendly with Lenin originally in Russia because he spoke Russian and he spent some time in Russia. And then eventually he became the go-to guy if you wanted to make contact with the Chinese communists, because he was very well known by the Chinese and so on. So he was a remarkable man, achieved a great deal in his life, did a lot of philanthropy with his work and so on. Somebody you probably don't know, Jules Stein. He was when he was a medical student, he played saxophone in a band. and he began to start making the arrangements for the band. He would arrange where they were going to play and so on. So he became the sort of agent for the band. Actually, while he was playing the band, he was actually worked with Mae West for a while, and he made a pass at her, but she thought he was too young for her, and she turned him down. But he became an ophthalmologist, trained through it, and did all the residency and so on. But eventually he gave up because his commitments as an agent for entertainers was becoming so much. And almost every single film star you can think of was in his company, which was the Music Corporation of America. Marilyn Monroe, Paul Newman, you name them, they were all his clients. So he became immensely wealthy and very successful, and eventually he gave most of his money to as philanthropy to set up eye institutes, including, I think he helped establish the Eye Institute at the National Institute of Health and so on. There's one in Los Angeles named after him. So quite a remarkable man again. Now, Maria Montessori, doctor, set up the Montessori schools. Robin Holbrook Smith became an alcoholic and then dried himself out and set up Alcoholics Anonymous. He was a doctor. And Edgar Wayburn was one of the leading people in the Sierra Club and the preservation of wildlife and the wilderness in the US. Again, another doctor. Now, finally, a few more dubious people. Surprisingly, in the late 17th, early 18th century, a lot of the buccaneers were doctors. Buccaneers were not quite pirates because they were sort of more or less authorized by the government, the British government, in order to plunder the Spanish treasure ships that were coming over from South America and Central America. And if they could plunder those, they were allowed to keep a lot of what they plundered. And a lot of them were doctors, including this guy, Thomas Dover, who made a fortune. He'd been a general practitioner in Bristol, which was a port in Britain, and then he became a buccaneer, very successful, and went back with his fortune to go back into practice there. But there were a whole bunch of them who did that, which surprised me. And John Henry Doc Holliday, another dentist, but you know more about him than I do, with his duel at the OK Corral with Wyatt Earp and so on. Sadly died, as you can see, at a young age from tuberculosis, not from being shot by anybody, but a great gambler and adventurer. Hawley Harvey Crippen was one of the first murderers. He committed murder in Britain, and he escaped on the ship, and he was picked up at the other end. One of the first murderers to be picked up because of the radio, because they radioed across to the US and said, pick this guy up, and he's just murdered his wife, I think it was. And then in the Second World War, Mengele, one of the great Nazi doctors who did unspeakable things to the people under his care and so on, and finally ended up in South America, I think. And in Britain, in relatively recent years, this guy was a general practitioner for all of his life in a small town. It is estimated that he killed over 200 of his patients. And he didn't seem to have a real reason for doing it. He didn't make money out of them, but he was obviously a bit of a nut. But he got away with it for years before they picked up on him. And then guillotine, the French way of capital punishment. Guillotine was a doctor. He didn't actually make the device, but he suggested that would be a way of it to chop people's heads off. Sam Shepard, more known in this country, it was very controversial whether he murdered his wife or not. There was a lot of discussion. Eventually it was decided he didn't. And if you think of Jack Kevorkian, who was a great exponent of euthanasia and enabled people to take their own lives if they wanted to. On the other side, you've got some religious figures. At least 3 popes have been medically trained. There are about 40 saints who were doctors. One of the archbishops of Canterbury, the Protestant church in England, was a doctor. And there was one fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons who became a bishop as well as being a surgeon. So there's just a glimpse of our predecessors. Thanks very much.